Good afternoon to everyone in this room and also to the invisible audience online. 2.5 years into the pandemic, I'm still not used to invisible audiences, but I'm happy that you were able to join us. Let me see how this works. Yeah, so teaming up in periodical studies, the story of WeChangEd. I want to start my talk with this little mosaic of pictures of the WeChangEd team. Now, all of the people that you see here, apart from me, have moved on to new jobs. You are looking at several future PhD students and postdocs, and one of them, Eloise, is sitting over there. A future doctoral schools officer, 2 policy advisors in open science and in gender mainstreaming, a professor of digital humanities, a Dutch teacher. So imagine them standing here by my side as I give this talk, because WeChangEd was a team effort, and all of these people contributed vital skills and expertise to the project. To give you a quick idea of the structure of my talk. So after a brief introduction to the project, I will say a few words about how the project was conceived. Then I will talk about some of the challenges and opportunities we encountered working as a multilingual and multidisciplinary team. And I will end with a sneak peek at what I'm currently working on. So first of all, introducing WeChangEd. And I realize that many of you have been introduced to WeChangEd at ESPRit conferences many times. Apologies if you're one of them. So I want to say a few words about the project to the people who are new to ESPRit. WeChangEd is the acronym of, and I've said this title so many times, Agents of Change, Women Editors and Sociocultural Transformation in Europe, 1710 to 1920. The project was funded by a starting grant of the European Research Council based at Ghent University, and it ran from 2015 to 2021. And the project focused on women's editorship. We examined how editing periodicals enabled women across Europe to step into the public arena, to participate in transnational exchanges of ideas, and to shape key processes of social and cultural change at a time when their formal rights and access to power were limited. And the project had 2 main components, a database and a set of thematic studies. So we compiled a database of over 1,800 female editors and their periodicals in 26 European languages. And we also conducted a series of thematic studies focusing on the impact of women editors on particular aspects of modern European societies, including salon culture, deliberative democracy, which Eloise focused on, fashion and women's rights. And by we, I mean, first of all, of course, the people I introduced you at the beginning of my talk. The core WeChangEd team was a group of scholars with backgrounds in the humanities and social sciences and linguistic skills in Dutch, English, French, German, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Swedish. But by extension, we also include the colleagues of the Ghent Center for Digital Humanities who helped us with the database. It includes the participants of the Conference on European Women Editors that we organized in 2019, and many of them went on to contribute to a special issue of the Journal of European Periodical Studies on women editors. It includes Catherine Thornton and Kenneth Seals-Nutt, the developers of the Women Editors Stories app, which I'll talk about later. And it definitely also includes the warm and welcoming ESPRit community and everyone who has generously shared their expertise with us at conferences and as peer reviewers. Now, if this sounds like a polite list of acknowledgements, it actually points to one of the primary methods of the project, collaboration. Teamwork was built into the methodological framework of the project, and it was a key part of the original project proposal. And that brings me to the first chapter in the story of WeChangEd, the early days of proposal writing. It's an essential and time-consuming part of any research project, yet one that's rarely mentioned on CVs, particularly if it involves failure. In the case of WeChangEd, the first stage took several years as my initial proposal was rejected, and I was sent back to square one, revised the whole thing, and submitted a new version. The funding scheme that I applied to was the Starting Grant program of the European Research Council, which, and I quote this from the ERC website, aims at researchers of any nationality with 2 to 7 years of experience since completion of PhD, a scientific track record showing great promise, and an excellent research proposal. Because the ERC operates on a bottom-up basis, it's a great opportunity for early career researchers to establish themselves as independent scholars and to carve out their own area of expertise. At the same time, success rates are low. They're only around 10 to 15%, which is really discouragingly low for such a significant time investment. So why do so many young scholars decide to apply anyway? One reason, I think, is that there is a darker reality behind this set of criteria. This type of funding often attracts young researchers who have been accumulating temporary positions since the completion of their PhD, who have been structurally working overtime to build a scientific track record showing great promise, and working even harder to come up with an excellent research proposal. This underlying reality is inextricably linked and intertwined with the history of WeChangEd as well. I applied and reapplied, not just because I'm passionate about periodicals and women's history, but also quite simply because I was running out of time. Back in 2014, I was a postdoc on a temporary contract. None of my applications for tenure-track positions had been successful, and this really was one of the very few opportunities that I had left. Oops. So the idea that failure is not an option that was driving me is a common and powerful motivator in academia where job precarity is rife. It is also a very destructive one. When I got the funding and was offered a tenure-track position at Ghent University, I was, in theory, finally in a good place. In practice, I felt exhausted and completely burned out. 2 years into the project, I had to go on medical leave, not knowing if and when I'd come back. So for almost 8 months, I was not part of the project, and when I returned, I needed another year to gradually resume my full-time job. And my story is not unique. It has happened, and it is still happening to so many young people. Periodical Studies too has lost some of its most brilliant young minds, scholars whose groundbreaking work we are still citing, still building on, even though they are no longer working in academia. If this period in my career has taught me anything, it's that emotional skills and self-care are as important as academic ones. Research themes like WeChangEd are temporary constellations relying primarily on temporary labor. With hiring young people on fixed-term contracts comes responsibility to provide a healthy work environment, but also to model healthy professional boundaries. And I'd say these responsibilities are even more urgent in research fields like periodical studies, whose institutional infrastructure is still a work in progress. Right, Dario? And it's particularly urgent if you're interested in working across national and linguistic boundaries. Periodical Studies now has its own well-established organizations, conferences, journals, but at the same time, it is still struggling for visible presence in departmental structures and educational programs. Everyone in this room or online comes to periodical studies from a different field and with a specific set of linguistic and cultural skills. With the WeChangEd team, we try to overcome these disciplinary and linguistic divides by carving out a research space of our own within the Literary Studies department at Ghent. So we were all working on the same floor of the same building. We had a shared workspace, a meeting room for regular team meetings and peer feedback sessions with the PhD students. We had a kitchen and a coffee machine for informal chats. And we also tried to make the most of the institutional infrastructure that is already available by organizing joint panels or giving joint presentations at conferences. Still, there were barriers and limitations to what we could do. We were a multidisciplinary island in a monodisciplinary sea. To give you a couple of examples, so the 4 PhD students on the WeChangEd project all obtained degrees, PhD degrees in literary studies, simply because WeChangEd happened to be based in a literary studies department. Yet all of them wrote either non-literary PhDs or PhDs in which literary studies was one of several disciplines involved, alongside women's history, digital humanities, and quite a bit of cultural, social, and political history. Another example is publication practices in the humanities, particularly the predominance of single authorship, which we could only challenge to some extent. I wish we could have researched and written more collaboratively as a team. Almost all of the co-authored articles are methodological papers that I co-wrote with the postdocs. It would have been so interesting for the doctoral students to work on joint case studies from different national and linguistic perspectives, but we were limited by the reality of academia and of PhD trajectories. PhD dissertations are primarily evaluated in terms of individual intellectual achievement, and so are academic CVs. So making sure that the PhD students had enough time to work on their dissertations and equipping them professionally as best we could had to take priority over some of the ambitions of the project. Still, I think that as a team, we did manage to tackle some of the major digital challenges of the project and of multilingual periodical studies in general. And I want to talk about that in a bit more detail. So first of all, the problem of data silos, and then secondly, the problem of single language digitization. So first of all, siloed data silos. A lot of recent periodical research involves data in some kind of digital format, whether it's the simple spreadsheet stored on your hard drive or a more sophisticated online database. For all the valuable information that these databases collect, they also act as data silos in that these databases don't typically communicate. They're really closed off from each other. And the WeChangEd database also started out as a data silo, even though we weren't really aware of this at first. In the first 4 years of the project, it functioned perfectly well as our shared multilingual research space to which we all contributed. We gathered data on editors, data on the periodicals they edited, and we also collected information on the organizations to which some of the periodicals were linked. And we structured all of this information according to a data model, which I won't discuss in detail now, but I'm happy to talk about it later. What matters is that we wanted to create a data model that would make our data as open and as shareable as possible. At least that is what we hoped. So everything went well as long as we were still populating the database. But when we approached the end of the project and we wanted to make our data public, we realized we had a problem. The database software that we'd chosen to use at the beginning of the project was great for collaborative data entry, but it did not offer a straightforward way for us to export our data and to make it public. Our data was basically stuck inside our database. That we eventually managed to get it unstuck is thanks to the tireless efforts of Julie Bergholz, the social sciences postdoc on the project, and several colleagues of the Ghent Center for Digital Humanities. And it's also Julie who proposed the crucial idea to make our data available as linked open data. Linked open data is, simply put, the opposite of siloed data. It's linked because it's structured, machine-readable, and interlinked with other data. And it's open because it can be freely reused, modified, and distributed. In 2019, we teamed up with developers Catherine Thornton and Kenneth Seals-Nutt to publish our data through Wikidata. Wikidata is a linked open data platform that is increasingly being used by libraries and cultural heritage institutions around the world. It's free, it's open, and it can be edited by both humans and machines. You have to think of it as an ecosystem. It's always growing, consisting of millions of items that can interact and interconnect in ever more complex ways. So to give you an idea of how this works, this is the example that we always gave when we were introducing our database and the transfer to Wikidata. So she's one of our favorites by now, Isabella Beaton, editor of the English Women's Domestic magazine. Now, Beaton was already in Wikidata when we transferred our data set, but she was only listed as a writer, a journalist, and a publisher, not as an editor. Our database, on the other hand, only identified Beaton as an editor because we did not collect any data about any of her other occupations. But in Wikidata, all of these bits and pieces of information that different people and projects had gathered comes together to paint a fuller picture of the diversity of Isabella Beaton's career. WeChangEd ended up contributing hundreds of names of women editors and periodicals and organizations, and the majority of them was completely new to Wikidata. So 49% of the persons, a staggering 92% of the periodical titles, and 68% of the organizations we contributed were new to Wikidata. I think this suggests that Wikidata had a huge blind spot for women and women's contributions to society and print culture. So adding our data was not only a contribution to periodical studies, but also an effort to close the gender gap. So, as I explained earlier, the data on Wikidata can be read by both humans and machines. But for humans, it doesn't make for a terribly gripping read. That's why we also collaborated with Cat Thornton and Kenneth Seals-Nutt to develop a Women Editors Stories app, which you can access at the URL on the screen. Now, this app draws its data directly from Wikidata and presents them as narratives in a more visually attractive and compelling way. So digital storytelling with Wikidata. The website, the app also offers a map and a timeline, which you can see here, and that takes you to the individual stories. If you click on a point on the map or on a picture, you can go to the individual stories of the editors. And any data, and that's a good thing about Wikidata, any data that's added to the entries in Wikidata by other people will also automatically be added to these stories. So this is an open-ended story that can continue to grow beyond the scope of the WeChangEd project. So here's Isabella Beaton in our story. And as people contribute more to Wikidata, we hope that this story will continue to develop. So going back to my slide with challenges and opportunities, there's one challenge that I haven't discussed yet, and that's single language digitization. As you probably all know, so many of the collections, the digital collections available to periodical scholars are largely monolingual because the library collections they're digitized from are largely monolingual as well. And it's not just that. They also act as data silos in that they're all structured in different ways, they're not cross-searchable, and some of them are closed off behind expensive paywalls. Now, to anyone interested in doing periodical studies across national and linguistic boundaries, this presents a serious obstacle. And it wasn't until the final years of the project that I realized that this wasn't an obstacle that we would be able to overcome, at least not with the resources and time frame of the WeChangEd project. But I do know where I would start with the fashion press. I would like to build a digital archive of 19th century fashion periodicals. One of my favorite case studies on the WeChangEd project was reconstructing the network around the German fashion magazine Der Bazar. Now, Der Bazar claimed to have numerous editions abroad, but in reality, if you look closer at this network, the relationship with all of these periodicals was a little more complicated, and many of them would not have considered themselves editions at all, but rather as independent magazines in their own right. So to connect this talk to the theme of the conference, mapping this network challenges our perception of center-periphery relationships in the 19th century fashion press. The English Woman's Domestic magazine, who's also in the network, edited by Isabella Beaton and her husband Samuel, is a great example because it occupies a central position in the women's magazine market in 19th century Britain. Margaret Beetham has done some wonderful work on the English Woman's Domestic magazine. But from a wider European perspective, if you zoom out, it was one of numerous magazines borrowing materials from Der Bazar. And then in turn, Der Bazar's own dominant position may also be surprising, given that all fashion is supposed to come from Paris, not Berlin. At present, all of these periodicals in this network are scattered across libraries and archives around the world. Many have been digitized, some have not. Some are freely available, others are behind paywalls. So bringing all of these periodicals together in a single digital collection would make it so much easier to study them together and to map, for example, the circulation of fashion images, the translation of fashion columns, and also how fashion advice was often adapted to local contexts. I think the way forward here would be to create a digital collection that is compatible with IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework. I won't talk about IIIF now, but if you're interested, I will say more about it in my talk on Friday, which you're all welcome to attend. Now, if you thought this was my sneak peek, it's actually not. There's something else that I am working on at the moment, something that I hope will develop into a new, larger project over the next couple of years. So for my sneak peek, I want to take you back to the 4th of June, 1913. On this day, a dramatic incident occurred at the Epsom Derby, which is the most popular British horse racing event, still is today. Emily Wilding Davison, a militant suffragette, emerged from the crowd and rushed onto the racecourse. Within seconds, she collided with the king's horse and was knocked to the ground. She died of severe head trauma 4 days later. It's not clear if Davison meant to die that day. We know that she was certainly prepared to die, But what exactly she meant to do on that day is still the subject of debate. But in any case, she has gone down in British history as the first suffrage martyr, the first woman to die for the cause. And as historians of feminism have pointed out repeatedly, the suffrage press played a huge role in this process. Suffrage periodicals, like the Suffragette and Votes for Women, were quick to describe the Derby event as a brave act of self-sacrifice. And they published elaborate accounts of Davison's public funeral in London, which thousands of people attended. So to give you an idea, this is the press coverage in the Suffragette in the 3 weeks following Davison's death, and also in the issue of the 5th of June 1914 that marked the first anniversary of her death. Now, if you'd read these articles in detail, you'd see that Davison is hailed as a martyr through numerous references to religious martyrdom and to the death of Christ and to Joan of Arc in particular. This has led historians of feminism to argue that the rhetoric of the British militant suffrage movement strategically conflated secular and religious martyrdom to imbue the cause with divine sanction. But I think an even more interesting picture emerges if you also look at a type of text that has so far been overlooked: the poetry that was published alongside the articles about Davison's death. Almost every article is accompanied by some form of poetry, whether it's a full poem or a poetry quotation, yet to my knowledge, they've never been studied. And I've only just started looking at them, not just in the Suffragette, but also in other suffrage periodicals. And what I've found so far is not just poetic references to Christ and Joan of Arc, but to numerous other martyr figures as well. There's a poem by William Morris about the funeral of Alfred Linnell, a political martyr of the Irish movement. There's an allusion to the military sacrifices celebrated in Alfred Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, and in Julia Ward Howe's The Battle Hymn of the Republic about the American Civil War. There are quotations from Shelley's The Revolt of Islam, a Milton poem about the biblical martyr Samson, a recent poem by Lascelles Abercrombie about the Babylonian female martyr Vashti, a poem by William Butler Yeats about the Countess Kathleen, who dies to save her tenants from starvation. And there's an interesting poem by George Eliot, The Choir Invisible, in which a nameless first-person speaker reflects on what it actually means to die for a great cause and be remembered after death. So the coverage of Davison's death is suffused with martyr poems and poetic martyr figures, male as well as female, religious as well as political and military, fictional as well as historical, recent as well as long deceased. And I've only just started to examine these poems in detail, but what's already emerging is a rhetoric of martyrdom that is much more intricate and diverse than you'd conclude on the basis of the prose articles alone. A rhetoric that also draws legitimacy from the many canonical poets it reprints and engages with. There's still a lot to think about, and this is actually just a very small piece of what I think is a much bigger puzzle, because poetry in the early feminist press, so the turn of the 20th century, in general is still largely unstudied, and not just in English language periodicals, but in other languages as well. So if you know of any scholarship in the languages that you have access to, or if you know of any interesting early feminist periodicals that published poetry, I would love to hear about them from you. So to conclude, what are we doing when we are doing this kind of research? And to go back to WeChangEd for a second, what was WeChangEd contributing? What were we contributing to? On the one hand, the object of study of WeChangEd was very specific, a bit niche even, and peripheral to several more dominant areas of research. We were studying periodicals, not books. We were studying women, not men. We were studying editors, not authors, even though these roles do, of course, overlap to some extent. On the other hand, our scope was far from niche or peripheral. We spanned more than 2 centuries, and we looked at Europe in the broadest historical sense of the word. Now, because of this double perspective, this double scope, I've long wondered how to define what we were doing as a team until Fionnuala Dillane at the conference we organized in 2019 called us cultural memory activists. So in her fabulous keynote at the 2019 European Women Editors Conference, which she later turned into an article for JEPS, Dillane described our work as an ongoing collaborative act of cultural memory making, changing the way we remember the past and so defining new futures for media studies and media history in the ways it frames narratives about women as producers of culture and of the public sphere. Now, that's a wonderful compliment, I think, coming from someone I really admire, like Fionnuala. But I think it's also a term that applies to all of us here and online. We are cultural memory activists. So, on behalf of the entire WeChangEd team, I want to end by saying that I'm truly grateful for the welcoming home that ESPRit has offered the WeChangEd team, and that I'm truly grateful for this prize, which really means a lot to me. So here's to ESPRit, to the Budapest conference, and to hopefully many more acts of cultural memory making. Thank you.